My fellow Americans, welcome to The Celluloid President, the podcast about American presidents on film. Today we're discussing Lincoln, Steven Spielberg's 2012 depiction of our 16th president and the passage of the 13th Amendment, which, of course, eliminated slavery.
We are stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands. Blood's been spilled to afford us this moment now.
I'm Gary Holmes, and I'm here with Jim Robinson, who can't stop telling humorous stories at inappropriate times. Jim, how you doing?
Well, I'm doing fine, Gary, and I guess that's better than telling inappropriate stories at humorous times. So thanks for the compliment. Abraham Lincoln, somebody we grew up with, as did many Americans. My first memory of Abraham Lincoln was getting the day off from school, grade school, because we really celebrated his birthday in those days, February 12th. And there was none of this Monday holiday President's Day stuff yet. And so I looked forward to celebrating Abraham Lincoln's birthday, get a day off. And I remember in grade school, we had little projects like using construction paper to cut out his silhouettes and things like that. So that's my first memory of Lincoln. How about you?
The first time, I think the biggest memory I have about him when we went to the New York City World's Fair in 1965. And I don't know if did you go? Did you go to the
Yes, I
World's Fair?
did.
Did you go
Yeah.
into the Hall of the Presidents?
I don't remember that. I
All right, so you
remember
go
trying
in
to find
and
my father who was
yeah.
drinking beer in the German beer garden.
Okay. This is the thing. You used to go, you would go into this auditorium, and there'd be all the presidents would be sitting on stage. They were these wax robots, Abraham Lincoln rises up and he starts reciting the Gettysburg Address or something. So I for some reason I was fascinated with that. And somewhere along that same time, we took a trip to Gettysburg, which is a big Lincoln shrine in a way. And I remember reading books about Lincoln, and we even had an old-fashioned 33 RPM LP, these old-fashioned records from the record players, and a record of his speeches. And I would sit in my living room and listen to Lincoln give speeches. It's the craziest thing.
Well, you're a little more obsessive than I've been about Lincoln, but what's always struck me is that as long as I can remember, historians who hardly ever agree on anything virtually all agree that he was our best president. Now, sometimes you see Washington at the top of the list, occasionally FDR, but there really has been a remarkable consensus throughout at least our entire lives that Lincoln was the best president. I'm not sure if that was true or is true in the South, but it was definitely true for where we grew up. And then the other impressions that Lincoln made on me is, as a speechwriter professionally, he was just such a great source of quotes. And you could never go wrong with your bosses for whom you were writing speeches for if you threw in a good Lincoln quote.
I have one other memory from that period, and this just sort of shows you how obsessed I was with it I was 10 years old, right? I guess I was 11. April 15th, 1965 was the 100th anniversary of his death, and back then you didn't do as much. You weren't commemorating every 25th anniversary, every 10th anniversary or whatever. So it wasn't something that the media made a big thing about, but I did. And I remember going to school that day, and I was like, sit a moment of silence in the playground before we went into school, because that was the exact time on the 100th anniversary of the day he died to the hour and all that. So, I was kind of a nut about Lincoln.
Well, something else with me relating to Lincoln, as a confirmed JFK Kennedy assassination buff.
Oh, right.
I've of course grown up with the eerie parallels that some have made between Lincoln being elected in 1860 and being assassinated and Kennedy elected in 1960 and being assassinated, and Kennedy's personal secretary being Evelyn Lincoln, and Kennedy being assassinated in a Lincoln Continental. I'm telling you, Gary, there's something there. But you're the buff. You're the
Yeah,
buff.
Oliver
So
Stone would Oliver Stone would agree with you, you know.
I'm sure. And
Um,
but you're obviously the Lincoln expert compared to me. So why don't you tell us about this movie?
all right. So, you know, this is not a traditional biopic like we saw last time with the movie Nixon. It only covers a short period of Lincoln's life, the last 3.5 months. Most of the movie follows his attempt to push the House of Representatives to ratify the 13th Amendment, which, as I said earlier, abolished slavery. So then we have a deep dive into why the amendment is needed, both legally and politically. There's a great deal of discussion about the push and pull of politics and the compromises and dirty deeds that are sometimes necessary for the greater good. There are also several minor subplots, including a last-ditch attempt to secure a peace deal with the South, which threatens to derail the passage of the amendment, and tensions within the Lincoln family, specifically over whether Robert Lincoln can enlist and participate in the war. After the passage of the amendment and the failure of the peace talks, the movie jumps ahead to April 1865 and quickly portrays the final defeat of the South and the assassination of Lincoln. Did I leave anything out there?
No, that's pretty good. In fact, um, when I think about what surprised me about this movie, the first thing you said is what surprised me, that it's not really a biopic. In fact, I would argue it's really a civil rights movie and intertwined with being a war movie. It covers a very short period of time, as you mentioned. It's striking cinematically. I was very impressed with the staging of the various scenes. The battle scenes that bracket the movie at the beginning and the end were tremendously impactful. The scenes in between those bookends, if you will, had all the appropriate grimy, smoky, chilly, late afternoon, dusky kind of lighting. There was really only a burst of sunshine at the end when the Lincolns were riding in the buggy, and the war was over, and the amendment had passed, and they were talking about their future. All very sad, of course, in light of what happened since. But what struck me about a movie called Lincoln is that it was about Lincoln, but not really in the final analysis.
Yeah, it really is about politics.
Right.
It's not a. I mean, the war is the backdrop, but it is not really a war movie. Most of what happens in this movie takes place inside. It's a lot of talking about constitutional law and all that kind of stuff. You know, this movie is probably the most highly regarded and successful of all the movies about U.S. presidents that we're going to talk about or that has ever been made. You know, it was a surprise hit at the box office. It had box office of $275 million worldwide, which is well above its $65 million budget. The top movies that year were The Avengers, which is $1.1 billion, the James Bond Skyfall movie, Dark Knight, The Hobbit, and Ice Age. And, you know, it was a big critical hit, too, in addition to a popular hit. It got 12 Oscar nominations, including Best Picture and Best Director. And the Oscars were won by Daniel Day-Lewis and Best Production Design. It's still a thorn in my side that the best picture that year went to Ben Affleck's Argo, you know, which is another historical, supposedly based on a historical incident. And, you know, that wasn't even my favorite. Lincoln, as much as I like this movie, was not my favorite movie that year. It was Zero Dark 30, which really should have won the Academy Award. So, but to have Argo win over both those movies is an outrage.
Well, if a James Bond film was on the list that year of big box grossers, I have to go with James Bond. But this was certainly a worthy Oscar nominated movie. And and I really enjoyed it. I think that in addition to being surprised that it didn't tell us all about Lincoln's life, um, I was impressed that it showed a not so honest Abe, an end justifies the means Abe,
Yeah.
because that's what he was. He was a great man, an inspirational leader. He was the best president of the United States in history, in my view. But in the final analysis, to get something done, he had to play politics, and often quite dirty politics.
Yeah, I mean that I agree. I mean, what surprises me most about it is in addition to that is the level of detail that they go into about what it takes to pass a bill and how you actually um, have to make these compromises and make these deals. A good deal, a good amount of the movie is taken up with how he secures the votes of the Democrats who are opposed to the bill, and how he goes about uh, offering, not not him directly, but offering jobs and appealing to people's good nature. And he really is a lot of arm twisting, and it's not. People don't just vote for something because they think it's the right thing. I mean, as much as we wish they did, politics is a dirty business.
Right. And it was also telling that when the final vote was taken, not all of Lincoln's lobbying worked.
Yeah,
He successfully persuaded some and he unsuccessfully persuaded others.
yeah, yeah. Um, and the thing that surprised me is Steven Spielberg and Tony Kushner, who wrote the screenplay, their faith in the viewer to sit through a movie in which he actually go into deep discussion about the constitutional elements of this, why the Emancipation Proclamation isn't good enough, whether he even had the right to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in the first place. It's just remarkable. And, why you need the 13th Amendment then. And, it's just,
It's a
I,
process movie.
yeah,
And you don't normally associate audiences sitting through a process movie with
yeah,
their barrels of popcorn and soda and enjoying it, but they
I
did.
know. Well, the parts of it that I didn't understand at first, I watched it a second time and oh yeah, I get what he's saying here about, like the slaves' property. And if, what does the federal government have the right to take away this, to say that the property is not the property in the states anymore. And, and what the war powers he has versus the civilian powers. And, yeah. And of course, the other thing is surprising, is the amount of vitriol that these guys threw at each other. Uh,
Right.
yeah, I mean, they insult each other relentlessly, endlessly, and imaginatively. It was,
Right. No, I learned a lot from this movie and I watched it twice. I hadn't seen it, I did not see it when it first came out, but in recent days, I've looked at it twice. I needed that second viewing in order to really grasp some of the concepts that were being discussed. I'd never thought about the concept that the Emancipation Proclamation might only have worked with the acknowledgement that slaves were property, because the war power he was invoking was the power to take the adversary's property.
well, the slaves were considered to be contraband.
Right.
I mean, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, but you know, at that point, the government was still pursuing the argument that the war was about keeping the Union together, not about eliminating slavery. And what happened was the slaves, when the war started, the slaves started running away, and they would come to the Union Army, and they were faced with the problem of whether to send these slaves back, which would be morally outrageous. Some general decided that he was gonna take them and consider them confiscated property, like like the cows or something. So
Right. Right.
um,
It's easy to forget that most of the debate about slavery leading up to the Civil War was about slavery's expansion,
Right.
not about slavery's eradication. There was a very active and significant abolitionist movement centered in the North and in New England, but there wasn't even with Lincoln the immediate insistence on the abolition of slavery. And most of Lincoln's speeches and contemplations and platforms before he became president were concerned with not letting slavery expand. He did look into the future and say, how can we really survive like this, half slave and half free? He did conjure up the idea of abolition, but he didn't call for it.
Yeah, no, I mean I mean basically a moderate. He was anti-slavery, but recognized that the national government didn't have the power to eliminate slavery completely. They just wanted to control its expansion, as you said. And in the South, it needed to expand. They felt they didn't want to be hemmed into the original slave states. They wanted to expand, and that's why when Lincoln got elected, they withdrew.
Right, and they were depleting the soil in their current states. In fact, the tobacco crop was pretty much ruined, and slavery was believed to be on its way out for a while, but then some genius invented King Cotton, and that gave slavery and the whole idea of these big plantations a new life. And
Yeah.
Lincoln as a moderate extends right into this film. He is a moderate in this film between the extremes on both sides.
Well, obviously they portray him as the moderate in between the radical Republicans and the conservative Republicans, and it's Spielberg does make a point of making sure that we can understand like who's on what side. They call one side the radical Republicans, and then we the leader of the conservative Republicans, we the conservative Republicans from mostly the West and the Midwest, will go along with this. This people wouldn't have said that, explain it, but that kind of line is in there for our benefit.
Right.
All right. So what do we think about the acting in this movie? What do you think about the actors? I mean, you can't stop. Yeah, I mean, we might as well talk about Daniel Day-Lewis at first because, in the entire history of the Academy Awards, I don't think there was a least surprising win than Daniel Day-Lewis winning that Oscar that year.
Well, I'd be happy to talk about him first, but not without going out on a limb first. And which is, I think Tommy Lee Jones stole this movie.
Well, yeah.
And was better than Daniel Day-Lewis. But Daniel Day-Lewis had the tougher job.
Yeah.
I mean, he had to portray a figure that everyone knew or thinks they know. The way Lincoln looked and acted and talked and his personality, the things we learned as we were talking earlier since we were school kids. But I'm not going to take anything away from what Daniel Day-Lewis did. I will say that I thought he was better. The less he said, the better I thought he was in terms of an impersonation. In the profile shots, he looked more like Lincoln than in the straight-on camera shots, when he looked a little too modern for my taste. The skin was a little too Hollywood actor clear. The teeth were too good. I mean, I have no idea what Lincoln's teeth were like, but he just looked like a Hollywood actor when the camera focused on him straight on. And when he told long stories or when he made long speeches, to me, my suspension of disbelief started to erode. But when he uttered simple phrases, when he was seen from a distance, when he was making one or two word comments, I believed him totally. And what did you think about him?
I thought he was great. You know, obviously, I've never heard Lincoln talk or seen him. He certainly looked like Lincoln. I mean, they did an incredible job with that, and I thought that you know, he didn't. I didn't see him as being as Hollywood perfect as you did. Like I noticed, for example, where when he was shaving, you know, where his beard was not shaved. You know, the hair was still kind of ratty, like he hadn't shaved in 3 or 4 days or something, and his hair was all flying all over the place. So, um, but you know, in terms of the voice, apparently his voice was even more high pitched in the real Lincoln than in the
Right.
movie. A lot of people think of Lincoln as having a deep voice, but it was supposedly very high pitched. So I think they did I think I thought it was remarkable. I didn't think he moved quite right. But maybe that's really because I just hadn't never seen Lincoln move. Maybe he was as awkward as that. I mean, he was 6'4", so and maybe he wasn't, you know, even at that age, wasn't used to his body yet.
Well, I'm going to defer somewhat to Daniel Day-Lewis himself because if you look at his approach to acting
Right.
in a number of his roles, he adopts a lot of the method approach,
Yeah.
where he really tries to get into the psyche, where he reads basically everything that's available to read about the historical figure, and he really tries to totally transplant himself into another personality. So, you know, who am I to say? I thought he
Right.
deserved the Oscar. He did a great job. It's just that on some occasions, he looked like he was acting to me
Yeah. Yeah.
instead of looking like Lincoln to me.
So Thaddeus Stevens, I agree that Tommy Lee Jones kind of stole the movie, or at least he, you know, he was a scene stealer if there ever was one. He played Thaddeus Stevens, who was the leader of the Radical Republicans. You know, he had the best lines, he had the best orotund insults. So he was, you know, my favorite well, when we get to favorite scenes, my favorite scenes involved him. I mean, I don't know if he actually I have no idea what Thaddeus Stevens was like. You know, you can look at pictures of him, which I did, and he didn't look like Tommy Lee Jones, but that's not to the point, I guess. But he was certainly the most vivid presence in the movie.
Yeah, I thought he was just awesome. And you're right. Um, you know, we know Lincoln. We think we do.
Yeah.
We don't really know Thaddeus Stevens. Um, I'm more on the side of Thaddeus Stevens, as you probably are. So you want to be more aligned with him. And he had a broad range of scenes and circumstances to work with, from being in bed with his multiracial
Multiracial,
housekeeper,
yeah. Black
housekeeper
housekeeper.
to standing in the well of the House of Representatives and making a great speech, to dressing down we're opposing him or he was trying to browbeat into voting for the amendment. So I thought he was just great. He's been in all different kinds of roles over the years. He's a ubiquitous, dependable lead and supporting actor. He was the JFK, conspiracy assassin leader in the JFK movie by Oliver Stone. He won an Oscar for his role in The Fugitive. He was Loretta Lynn's husband in Coal Miner's Daughter. And he was Al Gore's roommate at Harvard and made a speech on behalf of his roommate at Al Gore's nominating convention. So, you know, he's been everywhere and done everything. And I just thought he did an awesome job. He was nominated for an Oscar for this role, and he should have won.
I'm surprised he didn't win, to be honest with you, because it is a bravura performance. I mean, the guy is acting his little heart out, and he and as I said, he has the best lines. I mean, we'll get to some of those later, but I think maybe the reason that we like him so much, though, is because it's a more modern performance. I mean, he acts like someone who, even though his lines are more mid 19th century, the actual acting is, he's acting like someone that we're more familiar with.
Right, right. And then I'd turn to Sally Field.
Yeah,
Is it Field or Fields?
Sally Field.
Yeah, Sally Field. I liked her. I really liked her.
I know.
Um,
Surprising.
yeah, but I mean, people of our age remember
Right.
her first and foremost for Gidget and the Flying Nun on television.
Right.
And and then Smokey and the Bandit. And she's made a remarkable transition to being a serious actor and a multiple Oscar winner, right?
Well, she has one of the most famous Oscar speeches in history, which is "You like me, you really like me," right?
Right.
This is the one
That's what
that's
I
most
was
mocked.
referring to.
Yeah. No, she's a very serious actor. I just saw her in the movie 80 for Brady. That's a little bit of a joke because that is not a serious movie and she doesn't play a serious role. But no, she's a very serious she's turned into a very serious actress. And you know, I found her completely believable as Mary Todd Lincoln.
Right. She had a complex role to play as half mad, half loyal, half northerner, half southerner kind
Yeah.
of character. And I thought she did it wonderfully. Um, she was nominated for this role for the Oscar
Yeah.
and should have won.
Yeah. Well, she already won twice, so that was probably holding her back. Yeah, no, she was great. Um, I don't have any other anyone else. I mean, there's some other people I want to talk about. Well, David Strathern, who is the Secretary of State William Seward. I will say, in terms of impersonation, he really does look like Seward when you see those pictures. Yeah.
Right.
And he's another one of these guys that's been in a million movies. He's a real that guy. It's like, oh, that guy's in this movie. When I looked at his, I was like, who is that? Who's that again? So I had to look him up. He started out as in John Sayles' Return of the Secaucus 7 in 1980, one of my favorite movies from 1980, and I completely did not know he was in that. He was most recently in Where the Crawdads Sing. This year, I saw this movie 3 months ago and did not know it was the same guy. He's also in Nomadland, my favorite movie from a couple of years ago. Did not know he was in that. He played Edward R. Murrow in Good Night and Good Luck.
Right. Got nominated for an Oscar for that.
Yeah, yeah.
And probably got addicted to smoking if he wasn't already during that.
Yeah, but I mean, I would never have remembered that he was because he's
Right.
just one of these guys that totally blends into the role. So he's a good actor in that respect.
I thought he did very well. He had a heavy lift. I mean,
Yeah, he was in a lot.
of
In the movie a lot.
Yeah.
He
And he
probably had
played
more
an
scenes.
important figure. It's
Yeah.
interesting that they didn't touch upon his assassination attempt at the end of the movie. He was almost killed
Right.
right alongside Lincoln at his residence. They broke into his house and he was almost stabbed to death at this very same time Lincoln was lying on his deathbed.
Right. No, you're right. So he did have a lot going on in that movie, and I mean, the thing with Seward is, he was the leading candidate to be president in 1860, and Lincoln kind of stole the nomination from him in the Chicago convention, and then he signed on to be Secretary of State, even though, and this this movie is supposedly based on Team of Rivals and by Doris Kearns Goodwin. And there's a lot in the movie about the relationship between Seward and Lincoln because, Seward came in thinking that he was kind of boss Lincoln around and manipulate him, and that Lincoln was going to be the figurehead, but Seward was really going to run things. And then it turned out that Lincoln ended up being, surprisingly a firm leader, and Seward actually came to admire and respect him, unlike some of the other cabinet members
Right.
who basically only tolerated him.
Well, Seward is a very important figure historically. He was the governor of New York. He served he stayed on
Yeah,
through the presidency of Andrew Johnson. Seward's folly, we remember, is Seward is the reason we have Alaska
right.
as the 50th state today.
God,
So
can you
very,
imagine if Russia still had Alaska? Can you
yeah,
imagine?
yeah, we wouldn't be able to see Russia from our continental United States anymore. But I thought the two Lincoln sons played their limited roles pretty well. Um, the the actors Joseph Gordon-Levitt played Robert Lincoln,
Yeah, I know
and
him. I'm sure you never watched this movie, this TV show, but he was in Third Rock from the Sun.
right, he was a
Yeah,
child actor,
yeah,
and
yeah,
then he ended up playing Snowden in the Snowden movie.
yeah,
Um, and Gulliver McGrath, a child actor, I thought was cute and affecting as Tad Lincoln, and the kids were an important part of the backstory
yeah.
of this movie. It's interesting that for all of the focus during the movie about whether or not Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, would be killed in the war and how that roiled the Lincoln marriage, it's interesting that he's the only son that really lived on. He lived well into the 20th century. He's the only son that outlived Mary Todd Lincoln herself. Poor Tad Lincoln died at age 18 of, it's believed to be tuberculosis or pneumonia. So it's just an interesting historical note that there was a lot of focus on Willie Lincoln, who had died in the White House during the presidency, and how that basically drove Mrs. Lincoln crazy and affected their marriage. And that's why she didn't want Robert Lincoln to go off to war. But Robert Lincoln survived, and little Tad Lincoln, unfortunately, didn't.
Well, one thing that surprised me in a way, I mean, I guess this is a little bit of a simplification on their part, but there was another son, Lincoln son that died, Edward Lincoln. He died in 1850. So
Yes.
they'd already lost two children. Now, I understand that Lincoln himself did want Robert to go, I mean, to serve in the army because it was embarrassing for him. He's the president of the United States, and his son is off studying law at Harvard. Um, but they left out poor Edward. The other thing about Robert Lincoln is that he was Secretary of War, like in the 1880s or something. He
Ambassador to the court of St. James at
ambassador to
one
the court of
point.
St. James, and he was the last living person who was there at the Appomattox surrender. So
Hmm.
he was the last one that was alive when he died. And the other thing is, this is always, I had to look this up just to make sure that I was right. He had a son and two daughters. Son died. The daughters got married, but none of them had any children. So there's no Lincoln descendants.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that daughter, Robert Lincoln's daughter, Abraham Lincoln's granddaughter, died in 1985. I mean, not that long
Wow.
ago. I mean, and you would have think they would have made a bigger deal about it. I don't remember when that happened.
Right. Now, can we talk about actors that I didn't care for much?
Sure, go ahead.
Um, this is not necessarily about the acting, but I didn't really care for James Spader and his cohorts. And I know they were playing caricatures of the wheeling, dealing, grease people's palms, dirty politics, politicians. But I think that's the way they were written. But I just didn't care for those portrayals or those scenes that much. Um,
Well,
Especially when they had the fiddle playing with the sort of riverboat gambler music. It was, guess it was supposed to be sort of comic relief, the way they portrayed them as they chased down these recalcitrant House members to try to give them postmaster jobs to vote for the amendment. I just didn't care for it that much. And then also, he didn't do anything wrong, but the fellow that played Ulysses S. Grant, Jared Harris of Mad Men fame,
Right.
one of your favorite shows,
Yeah.
didn't make much of an impression on me. Grant is probably the only other figure in this movie that we have a mental image of, and it's an easy one to caricature. And we look at him on our money all the time, like we look at Lincoln. He didn't make much of
You
an.
look at what is it, they $50 bills? You look at those all the
Yeah,
time?
sure. That's what I get out of my ATM now
Okay.
is 50s. But anyway, he didn't make a big impression on me. Nothing wrong, but just didn't do much for me.
It wasn't, no, he did not have a very big impression, that's for sure. And I think that's part of Grant was a very taciturn person, a man of few words, and I think that's probably part of it. But you're right, considering how important he was, he did not, yeah, he did not have a big impact. Um,
What about the history?
well, hold on, I just want to
Sure.
talk about a couple of other things regarding, it's not about the actors per se, well, about the actors. I want to say something about the actors who were in the bits parts who became much more famous. This movie is chock full of famous faces, people who were once famous and are now and were in the movies. People who are going to be famous. You know, when Steven Spielberg offers you a part, I guess you take it, even though it's very small. And I'm just going to run through.
That's
You may not,
similar to Oliver Stone's movies.
yeah,
He
yeah.
seems to get a lot of very famous actors to play even small parts.
So there's a lot of when you're watching the movie, there's a lot of like, oh, he's in it, oh, she's in it, you know, all this kind of stuff. So I'm just going to run through some of these. So the very first, in the very first scene, we have two black soldiers confronting Lincoln. One of them is Daniel Aiello, who plays Martin Luther King in the movie Selma. I mean, he's kind of a big actor now, and so like wow. Oh, so he has some
Yeah, I
tiny
didn't know
role in
that.
it.
Yeah.
Adam Driver was a telegraph officer. He became famous on Girls and was very famous as Kylo Ren in the recent Star Wars movies. And he's a big movie star now. And his role was just to like tit 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 and you know do the Jeremy Strong, who's on Secession. He
Right.
plays Kendall Roy on Secession. He was John Nicolay, who was Lincoln's personal aide, and you wouldn't recognize him at all. I saw his name in the credits and had to go back and figure out who he was because he's wearing this crazy beard. You already mentioned Jared Harris. Now, there's a whole bunch of other minor, well-known actors who accepted minor roles. Jared Harris, he's in Mad Men, but he was also in King George. He was King George the Sixth in The Crown. You mentioned James Spader. He's a pretty big actor. He
Right.
was famous from Sex Lives and Videotape in 1989. He's a big TV star. He's on The Blacklist and on Boston Legal. Walton Goggins, who was on in Justified and The Shield and The Righteous Gemstones, he plays, you know, one of the congressmen that gets chased down. John Hawkes, another one of those operatives. He's an Oscar nominee for the Sessions, and Jackie Earle Haley, who plays Alexander Stevens, the vice president of the Confederate States, you know, was a younger star in Breaking Away and Bad News Bears movies. So, you know, all these guys, it's like he just doesn't go off and find someone from Central, you know, some obscure person to fill these minor roles. He gets, you know, fairly well-known actors. And of course, the real co-stars of the movie were the beards. You know, the way those beards were unbelievable. You
And
know,
the
little
spitting of the
beards,
chaws of
big bushy
tobacco.
beards. Yeah. What?
The spitting of the chaws of tobacco, too.
Oh yeah. And the spittoons. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple others I noticed. I can't remember his first name. Constable was in the. He was one of James Spader's cohorts, political operative cohorts. He was in Billions, the
Yeah.
show Billions, and We mentioned Esapatha Murchison's role. She was the African American maid and lover of
Thaddeus Stevens.
exactly. She was a staple on Law and Order for years and years. And of course, we have to mention Hal Holbrook,
Oh, right,
who was
right.
everywhere, everywhere, and a very famous actor, stage and screen and film actor, and who actually played Lincoln in two television miniseries. So he got to stand there on set and in some scenes with Daniel Day-Lewis and mentally compare notes, maybe thinking I could have done this better.
All right, well, let's talk about the history then. Um, I thought it was a very high level of accuracy. Every time I looked up a fact or a battle mentioned in the movie, it turned out to be true. Uh, this supposedly is based on The Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin, as I mentioned earlier, which I think is a crock. I mean, I have that book. I've read it. I When I read that this was supposedly based on that book, I thought, what? And I went back and looked at there's only like 3 pages in the book about the passage of the 13th Amendment. So, I think what happened is that Steven Spielberg read the book. He really liked the book. He secured the rights for it and paid for the rights and all that kind of stuff. And but then at the end, he decided just to focus in on this one small thing. And there's some elements of the movie that are based on the book, including, as I said, the relationship between him and the cabinet members, and the way he tells all these stories, some of which were, kind of dirty stories, which unfortunately I can't repeat here because, I want to keep this a little G-rated, because I know my mother might be listening. But the actual detail about all this, well, all the comings and goings, it was not in the Doris Kearns book, Goodwin book at all. So somehow Tony Kushner, who wrote the screenplay, went off and did original research or read other books or something to get all this stuff.
Well, I thought the movie, you know the history better than I, but I thought it it felt real to
Yeah,
me in detail. The question with these kinds of things, when you have to organize your material and you have to create a narrative, is are they intentionally or unintentionally elevating one historical episode to too high a place
right,
in history, namely the 13th Amendment,
right,
and
right,
having everything revolve around that? I think it was necessary to find a device like that. And it was certainly an incredibly important event in American history. But in elevating it, do they unintentionally create inaccuracy? And for example, much is made of the fact that if they ended the war too soon, the 13th Amendment might not pass.
right,
And also, obviously, much is made of the fact of Lincoln's indispensability
right,
in terms of passing the 13th Amendment. Well, that might be true, except that after Lincoln was dead and after the war was over, the 14th and 15th Amendments were passed,
right,
which were equally historic. The 14th being equal justice uh, and equal protection under the law, and the 15th actually giving Black men the right to vote. Decades before, as it turned out, that even white women were given the right to vote. So all of this uh, debate about the 13th Amendment and how Thaddeus Stevens had to basically swear that it didn't mean that he was worried about giving them the right to vote. Just 3, 4 years later, after Lincoln was gone and after the war was over, equally important amendments passed. Now, we all know what happened subsequently to that, how Reconstruction went south, no pun intended. And of course, all the things that were all the subterfuge that got in the way for decades in terms of the right voting rights. We
right.
all know about that. But I think that as time went on, the movie's historical accuracy was rendered overly simplistic, but not inaccurate.
Yeah. So I have a slightly different uh, complaint about the elevation of the 13th Amendment here. I think your point about the 14th and 15th Amendment passing, it's hard to say whether that would have happened, for example, if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated. You know, the turmoil and the vitriol that people felt against the South after he was assassinated might have given emphasis or much more strength to the supporters of the 14th and 15th Amendment. So maybe it would have happened, or maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. It's hard. That's hard to say. My complaint about this is there were two. The main argument that they were making is that if we have the 13th Amendment, if we pass the 13th Amendment that eliminates slavery, the South will somehow lose its will to go on, and it'll end the war faster, which obviously, and I got to say, during the debate, one of the Democrats, one of those racist Democrats, says, "Well, that's what you said about the Emancipation Proclamation, and here we are 2 years later." And it's true. The war didn't end when they eliminated slavery. They had to fight out those
Right.
last 4 months, and so it seemed like they probably could have waited. This whole idea that I don't want to wait until the new Congress comes in, seems a little disingenuous. I think I don't know. The whole purpose of pushing the amendment didn't really seem as necessary as it's presented in the movies, because a new Congress was going to come in March, and at that point they could have passed it like that.
Well, I think some historians have echoed that in saying that the chances of slavery really surviving and coming back after the end of the Civil War and the total demolition of the South, basically, its entire economy, was really unlikely. I want to echo also your point about how can we really know what would have happened if Lincoln hadn't been assassinated. And again, I draw parallels to JFK,
Right.
because people are always speculating if JFK had lived,
Right.
would we have gotten into the Vietnam
Right.
quagmire in the same way?
Right.
Would the landmark civil rights legislation that Johnson was able to pass, in large part by invoking the killing of JFK, would that have happened? Would Kennedy have handled the divisions that cropped up in American society during the 60s better than Johnson?
Right.
Would the divisions have even made themselves so apparent? So this is endless historical speculation. It's fun,
Yeah, it
but
is fun. Yeah.
we can't really know about
No, and
what
we
would have
can't.
happened had
Yeah.
Lincoln lived or if Kennedy had lived.
Yeah, we can't really know. I'll give Spielberg and Kushner, I'll give them some space here, and won't quibble too much about the focus on the 13th Amendment, because we only need to know what was in Lincoln's mind at the time. Have the benefit of the hindsight to know, well, of course it would have passed, but they didn't know that then for sure. And I guess he really did push it for whatever reason. He decided not to wait. And it's a historical fact that all this happened. And so we don't really know why, but it is just an interesting, it's almost like like Steven Spielberg decided to do a civics lesson by making this movie the way he did and focusing on this rather than something else.
Right. And the other thing that's interesting to think about historically, since we also know in hindsight how badly Reconstruction ended up being mangled,
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
is what would Reconstruction have been like
Right.
if Abraham Lincoln had been president rather than Andrew Johnson? And that's hard to know as well. But I would like to think that if he had survived, we would have put in place reconciliation and reconstruction and civil rights for Blacks better and faster and sooner than what happened.
Well, what happened is, I understand. I'm not post-Civil War and yes, post-Civil War historian, but as I understand it, Thaddeus Stevens actually was kind of running Reconstruction. Johnson, President Johnson was overruled on a number of things, and a lot of very punitive things were put into place in the South, and it didn't work out that well. So when Lincoln says to Thaddeus Stevens during one of these key themes, like if I had done what you wanted me to do at the beginning of the war, we would have lost the whole thing, and the South would have be expanding west and down into Mexico. And he's like, well, yeah, you got me there, but uh, so I don't know. I mean, I think what's interesting about this movie too is how it portrays Lincoln as a real master politician. He understands what makes someone tick. He knows when to appeal to someone's naked self-interest and when to appeal to their higher sense of themselves. He's able to assemble coalitions and balance a lot of different things. There's a big, we need the conservative Republicans say we need to have I mean, that we have to go through the peace process to show that there's no way of having peace. So we need to bring these commissioners up. But if the peace commissioners from the South come, that means that the radical Republicans will bail. So it was interesting showing how uh, politics is about assembling 50% plus one, right?
Right.
And Lincoln was able to put it all together and get people to compromise.
So that really takes us to what the filmmakers were trying to accomplish.
Before we get to that, can I just I want to do a couple nits,
Sure.
historical, some problems I have. Not problems, just I want to point out a couple of things. In the opening scene, you have these two black soldiers, then two white soldiers, and they end up both like reciting back to him the Gettysburg Address, which I thought was really kind of hokey, and probably very unlikely to have happened. They called the 13th Amendment the 13th Amendment, which they never would have done because it would have been an anti-slavery amendment or something like that. I mean, when we talk about the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, no one calls that the 29th Amendment or whatever. As I said, there's some simplification for storytelling purposes. They leave out the Unionist part. Like in this movie, you'd think there were only Republicans and Democrats, but there was a whole other party called the Unionist Party, and a lot of the votes for that came from the Unionist Party. The biggest fiddle in this movie, the biggest fudge on this movie is by overstating of the role of those three operatives. They did not play that kind of role. I mean, they were this guy, Bilbo, the James Spader character, really was only trying to get some people up in New York State to vote for it, and maybe he might have helped persuade one person. So this whole idea of the three of them were this like super lobbying team is not really true.
Well, I think the movie actually showed that it was only after Lincoln personally stepped in
Right,
that success was achieved.
right.
I had a question. It's a nit, but it's a genuine question. Did the House of Representatives really operate that way, like almost like a House of Commons, with
Yeah,
people shouting back and forth, questioning each other, and catcalling and all that?
yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think that was probably what it was like. I don't know. I actually don't know for sure. Actually, one of the nits I saw was that they don't really. I mean, this is probably not even worth mentioning, but they voted by state. All the members from the state of Connecticut voted, and then I guess that didn't really happen exactly like this. My biggest nit is because of my own. I have a personal interest in this nit. The telegraph scene. Whenever you're watching a movie about the White House, there's always some scene with some big underground secret place. The Situation Room is always gigantic, and there's the telegraph. Made it look like underneath the White House there's some giant, Grand Central Station full of a million telegraph people and they're running around. That is completely not what the White House, there's nothing underneath the White House, anything comparable to that.
Well, the West Wing didn't even exist then as well,
Right,
so there was
right.
even less room.
Yeah. And the reason I mention this is because when I worked in Washington for the U.S. Trade Representative's office, I worked in the Winder Building, and the Winder Building was actually where the telegraph office was. It was the Winder Building during the war was where the Department of War had its headquarters. And Lincoln used to walk from the White House to go over to the telegraph office in the Winder Building. And I had my office was on the first floor, right at the door was, and I always told everyone this is the room where Lincoln used to come to uh, to read about the telegraph dispatches from the front. So, and it was a much, I mean, it's a much smaller room. I mean, there's probably only one or two telegraph operators in there, not like 20 of them in a big office. So that's my nit.
Well, generally speaking, I think they portrayed the lack of modernity pretty well in this
Yeah.
film. I
Yeah.
mean, they didn't have lights, electric lights. Lincoln and others had to wear shawls all the time because it was so damn drafty and cold. And so I think they portrayed the times pretty well.
All right. So what do you think Spielberg was trying to accomplish?
Well, we've touched on it in several ways, but I think that the film was even more than focusing on Lincoln as a man and a leader. I think the film was trying to show the dilemma and difficulties of democracy. Even Lincoln had to buy votes and threaten people. It showed how grand, big, morally right ideas take sleazy practices to prevail. And to paraphrase something that Ronald Reagan, said all the time, the dilemma of do you take half a loaf now and come back for the rest of the loaf later? In other words, what amount of compromise is okay? And so I thought that was one of the big goals of the movie was to show that complexity, show those dilemmas, those moral quandaries, and also regarding war, the question of when do you go to war and when do you end a war? How much compromise to stop the bloodshed? This is something that's plagued people throughout history, plagued Americans. And remembering that the revolution itself was only supported by 1/3 of the colonists. The Civil War was a choice. It was a choice war. Lincoln and the Union didn't have to go to war to when the South succeeded. They could have just let it happen. Good thing they didn't, but they could have. World War I, you've pointed out on other occasions, there was no progress being made by either side, despite horrible casualties. So when do you end that war? When do you stop Hitler or when do you not stop Hitler? Do you go to Vietnam or not? And right up to the war in Ukraine,
Yeah.
do you send peace negotiators to Moscow or not? So I thought that was also an interesting issue brought out by the movie and a purpose of the movie.
Yeah, I would also point out this movie was made in 2012 during the Obama administration. I think what Spielberg is trying to do is, Spielberg and Kushner, good old-fashioned patriotic liberals, and I think they're trying to reclaim Lincoln for their side in a way, um, and I think Lincoln, I think Spielberg very patriotic, loves America, he made Saving Private Ryan, Amistad, The Post, Bridge of Spies. These are all like good movies about how great America is one way or another. Flawed, but still a great country. And I think that he's trying to uh, get people to be, to love America and to say that and show that liberals can love America too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. They did show that even the greatest of leaders and the most moral of leaders need to make compromises
Right.
in a democracy and even need to cut corners. It sort of makes a case for situational ethics, doesn't it? And now the cynical side of me will say that in the hands of those on the left, situational ethics only becomes okay when the pursuit is a liberal goal,
Yeah.
and that they might not countenance situational ethics when it's a conservative objective trying to be achieved. But I'll put that aside. I think that the movie raises a very critical issue, and Lincoln brought it forth during one scene when he talked about true north and how a compass shows us very clearly where true north is. But that's the easy part. It doesn't show us how to get to true north, and it doesn't show us how long it should take or it can take to get to true north. And I thought that issue of how do you achieve great things in a democracy, a pluralistic democracy, was a really important theme of the movie.
Well, let's talk about our favorite scenes.
Sure.
All right. I have, um, both of them involve that. My two favorite scenes involve Thaddeus Stevens, or Tommy Lee Jones. First, the the scene that you talk about where Lincoln lectures Thaddeus Stevens on the True North thing, and it's one thing to know what is true north, but you don't know the valleys and the canyons and everything in between. Um, that leads into the debate on whether Stevens will admit that that he's not going to be pushing that he doesn't. They want Stevens has to agree that not all men are created equal. And this, I just thought that was extremely powerful, where he um, formally says that he will not say whether former slaves will be able to vote or marry white women. And he just sort of explodes the idea that all men are created equal. I just want to read this quote because I actually had to write the whole thing down because it was so. But the way he does it is genius in a way. He says, so Thaddeus Stevens says, I don't hold with equality in all things or with equality before the law. How can I hold that all men are created equal when stands before me the moral carcass of the gentleman from Ohio, proof that some men are inferior, endowed by their maker with dim wits, impermeable to reason, the cold, pallid slime in their veins instead of rich blood? You are more reptile than man, George, so low and flat that the foot of man is incapable of crushing you. But even you, Pendleton, who should have been gibbeted for treason long ago before today, even worthless you ought to be treated equally before the law. That's a very dramatic scene, and so that was my favorite.
Right. And it was also, we'll get to this, and so I won't have to mention it then, but it was one of my favorite lines as well. And it really, that scene, it wasn't necessarily, the scene didn't play out in this context that I'm about to mention, but it has modern resonance in that what is equality? Is it equality before the law? Absolutely yes. Do we need equality of opportunity? Absolutely yes. But can we actually achieve, or do we want to achieve, equality of outcomes
Right.
in all things and no individuality between any two people? I think it raises critical issues then and now.
Yeah.
I love
Okay.
that scene too.
Yeah. Okay. What do you have one?
Well, yes. So most of my scenes were toward the end
Yeah.
because I found this to be a movie that built up emotionally as it went on, to the point where anybody with blood flowing through their veins is going to be choked up. And I was choked up uh, during a bunch of the scenes at the end. The little boy Tad Lincoln hearing about his father being shot when
Right.
he was watching a play in a different theater. Thankfully, it wasn't the same theater, and his screaming out in tears I thought that was incredibly impactful. I thought the Robert Lincoln scene of him so young and bravado about going to war, and then seeing a wheelbarrow full of amputated limbs being dumped into a burial pit at the hospital, and then later having a confrontation with his father Abe, and Abe Lincoln actually slapping Robert Lincoln's face. I thought that that was a favorite scene to me. I did like it was manipulative, but I loved the scene of Thaddeus Stevens and his mistress in bed, and her actually reading the text of the amendment. And I thought she did a great acting job in that one as well. That really choked me up. I thought the two, I mentioned this before, the two gruesome battlefield scenes that bracketed the movie were really important. They weren't necessarily my favorite, but they were important. And they were important that Lincoln was there, because nowadays we have carefully choreographed scenes of our presidents going to war zones, in the darkest, deepest security, and sort of play acting being in a war zone. And this is a nonpartisan comment. It's happened among presidents of both parties in the last 20, 30 years. But here you have Lincoln actually coming face to face with a war thankfully chose to engage. Those were some of my favorites.
I also enjoyed the scene where Thaddeus Stevens brings in this Representative Coffroth and bullies
Yes,
and bribes him into voting for it, and he keeps changing his name. He can't,
yes,
I can't. What's your name? Cough drop, cough snot. That was
right.
that was fine. A completely imaginary scene. I'm sure that never happened, but it was still very fine. I thought the assassination scene was very good as well. To show, instead of showing it the thing what you expect, all of a sudden you're watching Tad at an entirely different play because you know what's coming. During the vote, when the blacks are filing into the balcony to see the final vote, and everyone looks up, and show the people of great dignity, and everyone understands the importance of what's going on. That sort of reminded me of the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, when the black residents of that town are up in the balcony of the courtroom.
Well, the
Uh,
whole vote scene was done excellently. It's really impressive when a filmmaker can take an event that we know the outcome of and still make it
right,
suspenseful. And it
right.
was.
The last one I'm going to mention is down in the telegraph office when Secretary of War Stanton blows a gasket when Lincoln starts to tell a story during the Battle of Wilmington. It's like, oh my God, you're going to tell the story again? No, they were so
Right.
had it with him at that point.
I
Um,
actually shared I actually shared that annoyance.
yeah,
And it gets to my I emphasize slight critique of Daniel Day-Lewis's performance was we know we're going to get, when we see a portrayal of Lincoln, we know we're going to get these folksy anecdotes. And when he would start one, I would actually think, oh no. I want to mention a scene I didn't care for, and I thought, uh-oh. And that's the scene at the very beginning
yeah,
when
yeah,
it sounded like a kind of woke, modern civil rights grievance scene
right.
with the one black soldier rattling off in very modernistic terms, how they didn't get equal pay, and how they weren't equally treated. He was right, of course, in all of his facts, but I could have closed my eyes and that could have been a scene out of a 60s civil rights leader.
All
I
right. Well,
didn't like it.
the thing about that movie, and I agree with you. When it happened, I thought that the whole thing sounds kind of implausible, but when you look at it, what's going on is you've got two black soldiers, one who is who was a slave and was emancipated from, I don't know where he's from, Arkansas or something, or Mississippi. He's been a slave and he's been freed, and he's going along with Lincoln, and like he's happy to be there and he's very respectful. And you've got this other black soldier who's from Massachusetts, probably born free, probably grew up without, not in slavery, maybe even educated, and he's the one that's pushing for equal pay and all that kind of stuff. So it's an interesting, and it also prefigures the dynamic that happens throughout the movie, like pushing fast, going slow, accommodating. So I, I, I agree that dramatically I didn't care for it that much, but when you think about it, it kind of does work. And I also thought, again, it's funny. Lincoln makes this joke about how his hair is so unruly that his barber slit his own throat. And
Right.
the one slave laughs, the one soldier laughs, and the other one, is disgusted, just like Stanton is. I mean, it's like, here we go again. He's disgusted that Lincoln's telling this stupid joke. On the other hand, he's the guy who is one of the soldiers who's memorized the Gettysburg Address. So, you know. All right, favorite lines.
Yes. Well, I have just a couple. One you mentioned, and it's the one with Stevens talking about equality before the law versus equality in all things. But when another Stevens line, when he said after the passage of the 13th Amendment, the greatest measure of the 19th century was passed through corruption, aided and abetted by the purest man in America. I
Yeah, I
thought
had
that really summed up one of the most important themes of the movie.
yeah, and that
Um,
theme is that line is actually in the Doris Kearns Goodwin's book.
okay, all
So
right.
yeah,
And
that's
then I also thought it was a harrowing kind of line when the vice president of the Confederacy looked across at Lincoln during the last negotiating session and said, "Your union, sir, is bonded in cannon fire and death."
yeah,
After pointing out to Lincoln that democracy didn't save your union, didn't pull it back together. It took a war. And Lincoln couldn't disagree with that. And then I liked when Lincoln got fed up with the bickering among his top advisors at one point and slammed the table. And of the 13th Amendment, he just refrained, now, now,
yeah,
now. And that to me had echoes of Churchill's never, never, never
right.
give in. So those were mine.
I thought the funniest line was, "It's not illegal to bribe a congressman, otherwise they'd starve." Um, and I also had like the True North quote, and then the last line that Lincoln spoke in the movie I thought was actually quite haunting. He says when he's supposed to meet Mary at the theater to go see at Ford's Theater, and his last spoken line in the movie is, "I suppose it's time to go, although I would rather stay." And that is kind of what you think about at the end of your life, right? Like, well, I got, I'd rather stay, but I guess it's time to go. And it's like, he's prefiguring his own death there. He's not coming back. Relevance, and I think we've talked about it, relevance or to politics today.
Well,
I
the
mean,
one thing that I would add to that issue, and we've talked about this in other contexts, is everyone makes such a big deal today about how divided the American people are. Well, you and I lived through the 1960s, so we have some perspective on the divisions then compared to now. And now we've just studied a lot and we've reviewed a movie that talked about the 1860s. Come on.
I know,
Today's
I know.
divisions are minor compared to both 60s.
Well, and it's also, I mean, those are two very divisive eras, and there's also the 30s were incredibly divisive. And uh, you know, the whole country is one long fight after another, and for people to be wringing their hands now about how we're going to have another civil war or something, things were really, really. There were people who, like, yeah, they yell at each other now in the House of Representatives, and someone says you lie or something. someone was almost beat to death on this in the House of Representatives before the Civil War. So, this
Right.
stuff, yeah, we're
But
not
I
as
do think, yeah, I do think some of those messages and the messages of uh, how leaders then had to come face to face with the wars they created. I think there's a message for our leaders for today, especially as we seem to be in recent decades getting involved in wars through proxy,
yeah,
in preventative wars, in wars that maybe aren't as existentially necessary as the Civil War was to the nation. That there's a message of that the leaders themselves should come face to face with that question, and also the question of when do you end wars after you've already incurred a lot of sacrifice.
yeah, yeah.
I think
Um,
those are messages for today.
I want to add one other new category today. Could this movie be made today?
I think so. I think it was suitably modern. I think it earned some of its modern bona fides in that very first scene that I didn't care for too much, where you had a modernistic sounding list of grievances rattled off by an African American. I think there might have been a little more exposure of Lincoln's less than stellar record on equal rights for blacks. They might have brought out, for example, the fact that Lincoln himself flirted with the idea that maybe one of the best solutions for blacks after emancipation would be to move back to Africa. Then again, some black leaders were flirting with that as well. I think there would have been more negatives brought out about Lincoln on the whole issues of racial equality and slavery. But yes, I do think it could be made today.
I'm not so sure. First of all, if it was made, it would probably have to be a 8-part series on HBO or something. But and if it was made, it would have to be more negative. But there was criticism at the time that Spielberg was encouraging this great white savior syndrome, where it makes it look like white people were the ones who ended slavery, rather than and diminished the role of blacks and getting their own slavery overthrown.
Right. That's the reason we have Juneteenth
Right,
now, the holiday, because to emphasize um, that slaves emancipated themselves.
right. And in the last couple of years, there's been this movement to remove Lincoln's name um, from some schools, and so I don't know. I think that it's possible the movie would be made. I don't think Spielberg would have the same enthusiasm for it today, because he would be. I mean, I don't know what his views of the last 10 years are, but he's probably not as optimistic about the spirit of America now as he was 10 years ago. So I don't know. It would be, I think it would be a different movie. It wouldn't be quite so patriotic now as he was then. Okay, let's grade the movie. What do you, if
Well,
you were a high
I
school,
graded an A minus.
okay.
I think it's a must see movie for anyone interested in U.S. presidents and anyone interested in the some of the major events of our country. And I think it's definitely it's an enjoyable and moving theatrical experience.
I would grade it an A. I thought it was, I mean, I was never bored. Um, and I was enthralled the whole movie through. And it's beautiful. I mean, Steven Spielberg is such a great director. It's so well shot, and I got my mind was working the whole time, and I was fully engaged, and I would make it an A. Um, High school teacher, would you assign the movie?
I absolutely would.
Yeah, I
I think
mean,
it's very important. I do it for, even if for no other reason, I think it would shock a lot of the students to see Republicans being on the side of African Americans and Democrats being against African Americans and pro-slavery. I think that would come as quite a shock to many high school students in our country today.
I think you're right about that. Okay, so I think we have burdened our listeners, if there are any still left. This is a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, but Lincoln is a much, you can't get to be a more important president than Lincoln. So I think we're going to have to close out here. I'm just going to say again that this is our second podcast. I'm happy to say we're now available on Apple, Spotify, and Amazon. So you can follow us there. And please do. And you can probably even write reviews. So please write a review so that other people can find us. If you have any comments about this or anything else related to other movies that we've watched, go to our Facebook page. It's called The Celluloid President. You can leave a comment there. You can email me at garyholmes76@gmail. And you can tweet at me at Gary Holmes on Twitter. You can do none of that with Jim, because he does not want to be contacted by anyone. I think you can affirm that if you want, Jim.
Well, I don't mind being contacted by anyone, but I like the buffer of you.
Yeah, if there's any one of our college friends who have a problem with what Jim's saying, you can direct your comments to him because I don't want to interfere and apologize on his behalf. All right. So we'll see you next time on The Celluloid President.